are listening to Therapy Plus, a mental health podcast.
The views and opinions expressed by the guest speaker on this episode are solely those of the guest. The content shared is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice or endorsement.
I'm Thomas Seager. I'm an associate professor in the School of Sustainable Engineering at Arizona State University, the CEO of Morozko Forge, and author of Uncommon Cold, the Science and Experience of Cold Plunge Therapy. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about how to use cold plunge therapy as a tool in correcting mood disorders or resolving major depression. The case studies that are in the scientific literature and the testimonies that have reached me from readers who are using either winter swimming or ice baths or cold plunge to help lift their mood are incredibly compelling. So it behooves us to go into the mechanisms by which cold plunge therapy might physiologically aid in the treatment of mood disorders and improve mental health. There are three mechanisms that I'm going to talk about today that are initiated by whole body cold water immersion. And it behooves me to explain what we mean by that. It doesn't have to be an ice bath. I do an ice bath every day, 33 degrees Fahrenheit, so 1 degree Celsius for those listeners outside the United States. I only stay in 2 to 4 minutes, but I experience something called the gasp reflex when I first go in. And if you're new to cold training, then you don't have to do freezing cold. Anything that is cold enough for you to experience that gasp reflex, you know is cold enough to activate your nervous system. The next question is, how long do you stay in? Me, the 2 to 3 minutes is fine. I'm cold trained. I could stay in longer, but I don't have to. For you, if you're just starting out, stay in long enough to shiver. Shivering is your body's secondary defense against heat extraction. The first is vasoconstriction, which shuts off the circulation to your extremities so that you lose less heat through the blood. But the second is shivering. Your muscles begin to tremble. They generate heat to defend your core body temperature. If you're just starting out, go cold enough to gasp and long enough to shiver. There are three things that are going to happen in your body as a result that are going to support your mental health and help resolve things like major depression and anxiety. The first is metabolic. The second is the cascade of neurotransmitters and hormones that are produced in response to the cold. The third is the central nervous system effects. And I'm going to go through each one of them in order so that hopefully you understand these mechanisms and you might be persuaded to try it for yourself. The first, the metabolic benefits. It's important to know that the brain takes about a quarter of all the energy, whatever you eat in your diet, that goes to fuel all your energetic processes, wound healing, growth, exercise, your heart beating. About a quarter of your caloric intake goes to fueling your thoughts. When your brain isn't getting the energy that it needs because the mitochondria are defective or the disorders in the gut or disorders of metabolism, then it can't perform the difficult cognitive work that is often associated with other therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectic behavioral therapy. These are very powerful tools for managing the all or nothing thinking, managing some of the cognitive traps that you can fall into when your brain doesn't have the energy to go through the processes that you're learning from your therapist. when you have to question what your feelings, question the automatic responses that are coming out of your head and say, is this true? Is there another way to think about it? Can I find the dialectic, the two truths that might seem in opposition to one another, but can be true at the same time? This is going to be a strain for your brain. It's going to need the energy that it takes to do that hard cognitive work. So how does cold give your brain energy? When you're in the ice bath, it's no time to be doing crossword puzzles. But what cold therapy does is stimulate mitobiogenesis. That is, it causes your body to create new mitochondria. And it is the mitochondria that are responsible for converting blood glucose or lipids or ketones into the ATP that fuels almost all of the processes in the body. When you rejuvenate your mitochondria in the cold, you resolve metabolic disorders like insulin resistance, which could, if not addressed, turn into full-on type 2 diabetes. Alzheimer's is a good example of what's sometimes called type 3 diabetes. It originates in metabolic dysfunction because the brain is the single most demanding metabolic organ in the body. It needs healthy mitochondria to do its work. The way to get to healthy mitochondria is to immerse yourself whole body in the cold enough to gasp, long enough to shiver, to stimulate your body to remove the damaged mitochondria and replace them through mitobiogenesis with new mitochondria. When you fix your metabolism, you give your brain the energy that it needs through its mitochondria to do the difficult work of cognitive processing, the demanding job of meta-thinking, that is thinking about how you're thinking, about noticing your feelings, about using your thoughts to reframe your emotions. The second way that cold plunge therapy will benefit your mood or help resolve major depression that otherwise might be resistant to medication or traditional talk therapy is through the neurotransmitters and hormones that are released in response to the cold. The gasp reflex is part of what happens when you activate your sympathetic nervous system. That's the fight or flight response. This is what we mean by being triggered. When there's an event that triggers your sympathetic nervous system, your body feels like it's in danger. And you don't have to have the memory of the event. When you get into the cold, it's an involuntary reflex, this activation of the sympathetic nervous system. In response, your hypothalamus, your adrenals, your liver, your body responds to prepare you to fight or flight. And part of that response is the elevation of dopamine, the elevation of norepinephrine, the elevation of oxytocin and vasopressin, which is implicated in vasoconstriction. This increase in the levels of neurotransmitters and hormones that can't help but affect the brain. It is not possible to be in a bad mood when there are 3 times the levels of dopamine coursing through your blood when you're in the cold. There is nothing that will snap you out of your anxieties about the future or your regrets and shame about the past and bring you to your present moment like activation of your sympathetic nervous system. But that's not all. After about 30 or 45 seconds, as those neurotransmitters and hormones begin to impact your feelings and your thoughts, something else takes over. There's another involuntary response called the dive reflex, and that's associated with the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the rest and digest. And it is the interplay of these two divisions of the central nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, that leads us to the third mechanism by which cold plunge therapy can help resolve mood disorders. Recall, the first was metabolism and what happens to your mitochondria that can give your brain the energy it needs to do the difficult work of cognitive reframing. The second one was the dopamine, the norepinephrine, the oxytocin, the vasopressin that is stimulated when you get into the cold that causes you to feel differently about your mood. The third one is the interplay between these two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of your central nervous system. The dive reflex takes over after the gasp reflex. All mammals are wired for what's called the dive reflex that slows down their heart rate, that causes their brain waves to slow down into a meditative state. And this is, again, involuntary. It's part of your body's biological response to what you're doing in the ice bath. Some part of your wiring says, well, if we're in here, it must be for a good reason. Perhaps we're going to go diving to gather mussels, or we're going to go spear fishing so that our family can eat tonight. Whatever it is that has us in the cold water demands that we slow down, even though the brown fat and the shivering is cranking up your metabolism, that we slow down other bodily functions so that we can either hold our breath or so that we can withstand the cold long enough to complete the mission that brought us into the cold water in the first place. The dive reflex is associated with the vagus nerve, and it improves vagal tone, or sometimes what's called vagal drive. It strengthens the vagus nerve's action in the rest and digest division. These two, activation of the sympathetic, followed by activation of the parasympathetic, allow your body to exercise the central nervous system in a way that we can measure. The single best physiological measure of psychological resilience is probably heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is different from pulse. You might know that your resting heart rate is a good indication of cardiovascular health. That is, how hard does your heart have to work in beats per minute in order to fuel your ordinary bodily processes? If your resting heart rate or pulse is low, it means you're in good cardiovascular condition. But that's not what heart rate variability is measuring. Heart rate variability is measuring the difference between the beats. It's measured statistically in microseconds. That is, every breath causes a slight variation in your pulse. As your heart learns to adapt to the circumstances of your body or to the environmental stimulus that place demands upon the heart, it changes the pulse on the order of microseconds. And so that might be a sensation, like getting into the cold or burning your hand on the stove. But even your thoughts will change the pulse rate in this microsecond kind of way. The more variable your heart, the more adaptable your heart is to the stresses that you encounter during the day. Heart rate variability, then, is one of the best physiological measures of your psychological capacity to adapt to stress. And what increases heart rate variability? An ice bath. We have good data from people now using their wearables, whether that's a Whoop strap or a BioStrap or an Oura ring. They all measure heart rate variability in different ways. And so you could get different results from Oura ring than you get from a heart rate monitor. And that's okay. Because if you're trying to do something that will increase your heart rate variability, knowing it will improve your ability to adapt to stress, then as long as you're consistent in the measure that you're using, you can notice those qualitative changes. And we have good data from my readers that show heart rate variability can increase after adopting a practice of cold plunge therapy, sometimes by 2 or 3 times. There is one other factor. I said there were 3, but there is one other factor that is probably worth mentioning, and that's the social aspect of the cold plunge. I typically get in my ice bath every day by myself, and I'm fine that way. But if you're doing a cold plunge club, a winter swimming club, if you're going down to the beach and you're doing this with people, you're likely to feel a sense of connection and camaraderie with those people. Maybe it's the vasopressin, maybe it's the oxytocin, which are sometimes called the bonding hormones. And so when these are elevated in your bloodstream and you're in the company of people that you consider friends, maybe you feel closer connections to your acquaintances with whom you are cold plunging. And so I don't know if this is a unique category all by itself, or this is just an extension of the neurotransmitters and hormones that your body produces in response to the cold. But if you have the opportunity to ice bath with your partner, or to create a club and do this outdoors together, or maybe in the winter in a pool, you're probably going to find that your friendships deepen, your sense of support and connectivity to those people is stronger. And so perhaps I should say that there are 4 mechanisms by which cold plunge therapy can help resolve mood disorders. The first is metabolism. By rejuvenating your mitochondria and stimulating mitobiogenesis, you will recruit brown fat to your body. That is a type of fat that is packed with mitochondria that exists for cold thermogenesis. And I'll talk about it more in a minute. But the metabolic benefits of the cold plunge that give your brain the mitochondrial function that it needs to do the hard work of cognitive reframing. That's the first. The second is the neurotransmitters and hormones like dopamine that are released in your body as a result of your plunge into the ice water. And the third, the exercising of the central nervous system, the interplay between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions that improve heart rate variability. When you do it with friends or with a partner, the sense of connection that you're going to get is also going to be beneficial for your mood and your anxieties. And I should, before I go, talk a little bit more about the brown fat and the brain. I mentioned that when you're first starting off, you go cold enough to gasp and long enough to shiver. But after you've done this for about 2 weeks, your muscles will not shiver in the same way. And this is because mitobiogenesis is taking place in select fat cells that get packed with mitochondria to fuel something called non-shivering thermogenesis. This is brown fat. And medical doctors used to say there's no such thing as brown fat in an adult human being. Infants have it, children have it, but we used to believe that adults just grew out of it. And that's not true. Back in about 2007 or 2008, a Swedish team of researchers discovered brown fat in PET scans in less than 5% of the human population. That's the portion of the population that is still getting cold. If you do about 2 weeks of regular cold plunge therapy, cold enough to gasp, long enough to shiver, your body will make new brown fat for non-shivering thermogenesis to defend your core body temperature in the cold. But brown fat is not just for metabolism. Although it remains in constant communication with the thyroid and it's essential to regulating your metabolism, brown fat is also a secretory organ. That is, it will produce neuroprotective factors like FGF21 and brain-derived neuroprotective factor, both of which are associated with higher levels of brown fat. That is to say, getting in the cold, recruiting the brown fat is a way of protecting your brain, either from injury or damage due to addiction or chemical dependency. It is a way of strengthening your brain that goes beyond the metabolic benefits that might come in handy if you're struggling with anxiety or depression or any other of the mood disorders that are characteristic of the people who find themselves in winter, for example, a seasonal affective disorder, or find themselves feeling low. You can find more about me in my writing at morozkoforge.com. Click on the Science tab or search online for ice bath depression and click on the Morozko Forge link. Or you can find the Uncommon Cold book at the Morozko Forge website. We ship all over the world, and you could read more about the science and the experience of cold plunge therapy. Thanks for listening.